My dad hit me with a belt, and I smiled. The leather cracked across my back, and I felt the sting bloom hot and sharp through my t-shirt, spreading like fire across my shoulder blades. I was 17 years old, standing in our kitchen with my hands gripping the counter edge so hard my knuckles had gone white. My father stood behind me, breathing heavy from exertion and rage. The belt doubled in his fist, his face red and twisted with that particular fury I'd learned to recognize over the years. This was the fury that meant he'd been drinking since noon, that something had gone wrong at work, that my mother had said something he didn't like, that the world had disappointed him again and someone needed to pay for it. Usually that someone was me, but this time, instead of crying or apologizing or begging him to stop like I'd done 100 times before, I turned around slowly and smiled at him. The smile wasn't defiance or bravery. It was something else entirely, something that had been building in me for months without my fully understanding what it was. My father's eyes widened when he saw my expression, confusion replacing the anger for just a moment. "What the hell are you smiling about?" he demanded, raising the belt again. I kept smiling, feeling blood trickle down my back where the buckle had caught skin, tasting copper in my mouth from where I'd bitten my tongue to keep from crying out. "I'm smiling because this is the last time you'll ever hit me," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the pain radiating through my body. "I'm 17 now. In 8 months I turn 18 and I'm gone. Every time you hit me from now on, I'll smile because I'm counting down the days until you never see me again." My father's face went from red to purple, veins standing out on his forehead like twisted ropes. He raised the belt higher and I didn't flinch, didn't move, just kept that smile fixed on my face while maintaining eye contact. For the first time in my life, I saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been fear or recognition that he was losing control over me. He lowered the belt slowly, breathing hard through his nose. "You ungrateful little shit," he said, his voice shaking. "After everything I've done for you, putting a roof over your head, food in your stomach, clothes on your back, this is how you repay me? With disrespect?" I wanted to laugh at his twisted logic. This idea that providing basic necessities somehow purchased the right to brutalize your own child. Instead, I kept smiling and said nothing, which seemed to enrage him more than any words could have. He threw the belt on the floor and stormed out of the kitchen, his heavy footsteps shaking the cheap laminate as he headed to his bedroom and slammed the door. I heard him yelling at my mother through the walls, blaming her for raising a disrespectful son, threatening her with consequences if she didn't fix my attitude. I stood in the kitchen alone, my back on fire, my hand still gripping the counter, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. I'd been afraid of my father my entire life, afraid of his temper, his fists, his belt, his words that could cut deeper than any physical wound. But in that moment, watching him retreat to his room like a child throwing a tantrum, I realized something profound. He only had power over me because I gave it to him, and I was done giving. I went to my room and pulled off my shirt carefully, wincing as the fabric peeled away from the welts on my back. I used my phone to take pictures of the damage, documenting the raised red lines, the spot where the buckle had broken skin, the bruises already forming in purple and yellow patterns. I'd never documented his violence before, had always been too scared or ashamed or convinced that this was somehow normal, that all fathers disciplined their sons this way, but I was done pretending. I saved the photos to a cloud drive my father didn't know existed, along with dozens of other pictures I'd been secretly taking over the past 6 months. Bruises on my ribs from when he'd punched me for talking back, welts on my arms from when he'd used a wooden spoon, a black eye from when I'd accidentally broken a plate while washing dishes. The documentation had started after a guidance counselor at school named Mrs. Reeves had pulled me aside in the hallway one day. She'd noticed bruises on my wrists and asked directly if everything was okay at home. I'd lied automatically, years of conditioning making the denial reflexive. "I'm fine, just clumsy, you know. Play a lot of basketball, get knocked around." But Mrs. Reeves had looked at me with eyes that said she knew exactly what those bruises meant, that she'd seen this pattern before in other students. "If you ever need help," she'd said quietly, pressing a card into my hand, "there are people who can help you. You don't have to live like this." I'd thrown the card away, but her words had planted something in my mind, a seed that grew slowly over the following months. What if I didn't have to live like this? What if there was a way out before I turned 18? I started researching emancipation laws in our state, reading through legal websites late at night when my parents were asleep. The requirements seemed impossible at first. I needed proof of financial independence, a stable living situation, evidence that emancipation was in my best interests. But the more I read, the more I realized there might be a path forward. I had a job working at a grocery store 3 nights a week and weekends, making minimum wage but saving every penny in an account my father couldn't access. I'd been doing this since I was 15, initially just wanting money for video games and normal teenage things. Now that money represented something more important: freedom, survival, escape. I calculated that I had almost $4,000 saved, enough for a security deposit and first month's rent on a cheap apartment if I could find one. The idea of emancipation became my obsession. I researched every aspect, learning that I'd need a lawyer to file the petition, that there would be a court hearing, that my parents could contest it. The thought of standing in front of a judge and explaining why I needed to legally separate from my family terrified me, but not as much as the thought of spending another year under my father's roof. I started building my case methodically, documenting everything. I kept a journal hidden in a lockbox under my bed, recording every incident of abuse with dates, times, and descriptions. I took photos of every bruise and cut. I saved threatening text messages my father sent when he was drinking. I recorded audio on my phone during his worst rages, capturing his screaming and the sounds of him throwing things or hitting me. Evidence. That's what Mrs. Reeves had unknowingly taught me I needed. Evidence that could speak when my voice failed. 3 weeks after the belt incident, I went back to Mrs. Reeves. I found her in her office during lunch period and closed the door behind me. "I need help," I said, without preamble, my voice cracking despite my intention to stay calm. "You said there were people who could help me. I'm ready now." Mrs. Reeves set down the sandwich she'd been eating and gave me her full attention. I showed her some of the photos on my phone, not all of them, just enough to make my situation clear. I watched her face change from concern to horror to a kind of determined anger that I recognized from my own reflection lately. "How long has this been happening?" she asked quietly. "My whole life," I admitted. "But it's gotten worse since my mom lost her job 6 months ago. He blames her for everything, and when he can't hit her because she fights back, he hits me instead." Mrs. Reeves made some calls while I sat in her office, my leg bouncing nervously as I listened to her half of the conversations. She spoke to someone at Child Protective Services, then someone at a legal aid organization, then someone else whose title I didn't catch. When she hung up after the third call, she turned to me with an expression that was both encouraging and worried. "There's a lawyer named David Kowalski who handles emancipation cases pro bono for students in situations like yours. He's willing to meet with you today after school if you can get there. I can drive you." I wanted to hug her but settled for nodding, afraid that if I tried to speak I'd start crying and wouldn't be able to stop. "Thank you," I managed finally. "I don't know why you're helping me, but thank you." Mrs. Reeves reached across her desk and squeezed my hand briefly. "Every kid deserves to be safe in their own home. When that's not possible, they deserve help getting out." David Kowalski's office was in a rundown strip mall, between a bail bondsman and a tax preparation service. Mrs. Reeves waited in her car while I went inside, finding a small reception area with worn carpet and mismatched furniture. David himself was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with wire-rimmed glasses and a beard that needed trimming. He shook my hand firmly and gestured me into his office, which was crammed with filing cabinets and law books. "Mrs. Reeves filled me in on your situation," he said, sitting behind his desk and pulling out a legal pad. "I need you to tell me everything, starting from as far back as you can remember. Don't leave anything out, even if it seems minor. Every detail matters when we're building a case for emancipation." So I told him everything. Years of violence and fear compressed into a 2-hour conversation that left me exhausted and shaking. David took notes without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates or specific incidents. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "This is one of the clearer cases I've seen," he said finally. "You have documentation, evidence, a pattern of abuse going back years. You're employed and have savings. Your grades are good despite your home situation." I checked with Mrs. Reeves. "You're 17 and close to 18. A judge will take all of this seriously." He leaned forward again, his expression serious. "But you need to understand what you're starting here. Filing for emancipation means your parents will know you're trying to legally separate from them. If your father is as volatile as you describe, this could make things more dangerous for you in the short term. We'll request a temporary restraining order. But enforcement can be inconsistent. Are you prepared for potential retaliation?" The question hung in the air between us. Was I prepared? Could anyone truly be prepared for their father's rage when backed into a corner? I thought about that smile I'd given him in the kitchen, the way fear had flickered in his eyes when he realized he was losing control. "I'm prepared," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "I'm more scared of staying than leaving. At least if I file for emancipation, there's a chance things get better. If I do nothing, I know exactly how the next year plays out. More beatings, more fear, more of my mother pretending not to see what's happening. I'd rather take my chances with the unknown." David nodded slowly, something like respect crossing his face. "Okay then, let's get started. I'll need copies of all your documentation, photos, journal entries, recordings, everything. We'll file the petition this week, along with a request for emergency temporary restraining order. The court will schedule a hearing within 30 days usually." I spent the next week living in a strange state of anticipation and dread. At home, I was careful to avoid my father as much as possible, working extra shifts at the grocery store and staying in my room when I had to be in the house. My mother noticed something was different, cornering me in the hallway one evening while my father was passed out drunk in front of the television. "What's going on with you?" she asked, her voice pitched low so he wouldn't hear. "You're never home anymore. Your father thinks you're avoiding him." I looked at my mother, this woman who'd given birth to me and then spent 17 years pretending not to notice when her husband beat their son. I felt a complicated mix of pity and anger that I couldn't fully articulate. I am avoiding him, I said flatly. Seems like a smart survival strategy given that he hits me. My mother flinched like I'd slapped her. Don't exaggerate. He disciplines you when you're disrespectful. That's different. Her casual dismissal of years of abuse made something snap inside me. You know what, Mom? I used to think you were just scared of him too, that you stayed because you didn't have options. But I realize now, you're complicit. You watch him hurt me and you do nothing. You make excuses. You gaslight me into thinking this is normal discipline when we both know it's not. That makes you just as guilty as he is. My mother's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Before she could respond, I pushed past her and went to my room, locking the door behind me. I heard her standing in the hallway for a long moment, before her footsteps retreated. That night, I lay awake thinking about the concept of complicity, about how silence and inaction could be just as damaging as violence itself. My mother had never hit me, but she'd also never protected me, and in some ways that felt like an even deeper betrayal. The petition was filed on a Thursday morning. David called to let me know it had been submitted to the court and that a hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. He'd also filed the emergency restraining order, which a judge had granted temporarily pending a full hearing. A sheriff's deputy will serve your father with both documents today, David explained. You should not be at home when that happens. Do you have somewhere safe you can stay for a few days? I thought about my options. My best friend Trevor lived 2 blocks away in a house with parents who'd always been kind to me. I can ask a friend, I told David. Good. Once your father is served, his reaction is unpredictable. The restraining order requires him to stay at least 100 yards away from you, but a piece of paper doesn't stop fists. Be smart, be safe, and call me if anything happens. I called Trevor from the grocery store during my break and explained the situation in broad strokes. Trevor had known my dad was strict, but I'd never told him about the physical abuse, too ashamed to admit what my home life was really like. Jesus Christ, Trevor said when I finished. I had no idea it was that bad. Of course you can stay here. My parents will understand. That evening, I packed a duffel bag with clothes, my laptop, important documents, and the lockbox containing my journal and evidence. I left through my bedroom window after my father had settled in for the night, dropping the bag first and then climbing out carefully. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Sneaking away like a thief, except I was stealing myself back from a situation that had been stealing pieces of my soul for years. I walked to Trevor's house under streetlights that turned everything yellow and surreal, my heart pounding with each step, expecting my father's truck to appear at any moment. Trevor's parents, Kenneth and Diana, met me at the door with expressions of concern and kindness that made my throat tight. Trevor told us what's happening, Diana said, ushering me inside. You can stay here as long as you need. We're proud of you for taking steps to protect yourself. That takes incredible courage. I wanted to tell her it wasn't courage, it was desperation, but I just nodded and followed Trevor to the guest room. That night, I lay in a bed that wasn't mine, in a house where no one screamed or threw things or used violence as a form of communication, and I couldn't sleep. The silence was too loud. I was so accustomed to chaos that peace felt alien and wrong. Around 2 a.m, my phone started buzzing with texts from my father. The messages started confused, then angry, then threatening, then pleading. Where are you? Come home right now. You're grounded. I'll have you arrested. Please come home, we can talk. I'm sorry. I'll change. You ungrateful bastard. You're dead to me. The emotional whiplash was dizzying. David had warned me not to respond to any communication from my father, that it could be used against me, or could violate the restraining order in ways that complicated things. I screenshot every message and sent them to David, documenting the harassment. My father called 17 times before I finally blocked his number. Then he started calling from my mother's phone. I blocked that too. Around 4 a.m, Trevor knocked softly on my door. You okay? I heard your phone going crazy. I let him in and showed him the screenshots. Trevor read through them, his expression darkening. Your dad is unhinged, he said flatly. I'm glad you got out when you did. We stayed up the rest of the night talking, me finally telling someone my age about the reality of my childhood. Trevor listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just being present in a way that felt healing in itself. The sheriff served my father with the restraining order and emancipation petition the next afternoon. David called to confirm it had been completed and to warn me that my father had apparently become belligerent with the deputy, threatening legal action and claiming the whole thing was a misunderstanding. He's hired a lawyer, David told me, someone named Gregory Finch who specializes in family law. They're going to fight the emancipation and challenge the restraining order. This is expected. Don't let it shake you. But it did shake me. The idea of facing my father in court, of having lawyers argue about whether my abuse was real or exaggerated, of potentially having a judge decide I needed to go back home, it all felt overwhelming. That evening, my mother called from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. How could you do this to us? She sobbed immediately. Filing court papers, getting a restraining order against your own father. He's devastated. We're devastated. This is tearing our family apart. Her words were so absurd they almost made me laugh. Mom, there's no family to tear apart. There's an abuser, an enabler, and a victim. That's not a family, that's a hostage situation. I'm done being the hostage. My mother's crying intensified. He only disciplines you because he loves you, because he wants you to be a good man. You're too young to understand, but someday you'll have children and you'll see that raising them requires tough love sometimes. I felt cold, listening to her justify years of violence as tough love. This woman who'd stood by while her husband brutalized their son, and convinced herself it was for my own good. If you believe that, I said quietly, then you're more broken than he is. At least he knows he's wrong even if he won't admit it. You've actually convinced yourself this is normal. That's pathetic. I hung up before she could respond and blocked her number too. I sat on the edge of the bed shaking, adrenaline coursing through me from the confrontation. The 3 weeks before the hearing passed in a strange suspended animation. I stayed at Trevor's house, went to school, worked my shifts at the grocery store. Life continued in its mundane patterns while underneath, everything was shifting. Mrs. Reeves checked on me daily, making sure I was okay and reminding me that what I was doing took strength. Other teachers noticed the change too. I'd always been a quiet kid who kept his head down, but now I participated in class discussions, made eye contact, smiled occasionally. It was like I'd been holding my breath for 17 years and finally started breathing. David prepared me extensively for the court hearing, running through likely questions and teaching me how to present my case calmly and factually. The judge will want to see that you're mature enough to handle independent living, he explained. Answer questions directly, don't editorialize, and most importantly, don't let your father's lawyer provoke you into losing your temper. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at 9. Trevor's parents both took off work to attend, along with Mrs. Reeves, who'd submitted a written statement as a witness to my home situation. David met us at the courthouse, an imposing building downtown with marble floors and security checkpoints. My hands were shaking as we went through the metal detectors. David put a steadying hand on my shoulder. Remember what we practiced. You're going to do great. We entered the courtroom, and I saw my parents for the first time in 3 weeks. My father sat at a table with his lawyer, Gregory Finch, a man in an expensive suit who exuded aggressive confidence. My mother sat in the gallery behind them, her face puffy from crying. My father's eyes locked on mine, and the hatred in them was palpable. I smiled at him the same way I'd smiled in the kitchen when he hit me with the belt. The smile that said, "You have no power over me anymore." Judge Marianne Sullivan called the hearing to order. She was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to assess everyone in the room instantly. David presented our petition first, laying out the case for my emancipation methodically. He submitted evidence, photos of injuries, medical records from a school nurse who documented suspicious bruises, my bank statements showing financial capability, employment records, my academic transcripts. He called Mrs. Reeves to the stand, and she testified about observing signs of abuse and my emotional state. Then David called me. I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt disconnected from my body, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. David asked me to describe my home life. I spoke calmly, factually, exactly as we'd practiced. I described specific incidents of violence, going back years. I explained how I'd learned to predict my father's moods, to make myself small and invisible, to take beatings without crying so they'd end faster. Gregory Finch, my father's lawyer, cross-examined me aggressively. He suggested I was exaggerating normal discipline, that teenage boys often clashed with their fathers, that some of my injuries could have come from sports or roughhousing with friends. He painted me as a rebellious teen who wanted freedom without parental oversight, who was weaponizing the court system to avoid reasonable rules. I kept my voice steady as I answered his questions, refusing to be rattled. When he suggested that the belt incident that started this was justified because I'd been disrespectful, something in me snapped. I smiled when he hit me, I said, looking directly at my father. Do you know why? Because in that moment I realized he couldn't break me anymore. I'd survived 17 years of his violence and I was still standing. That smile was me taking my power back. He could hit me 1,000 more times and it wouldn't matter because I'd already won. I'd survived him. The courtroom went silent. Judge Sullivan leaned forward slightly. Tell me about that smile, she said, her voice neutral. So I did. I explained how fear had ruled my life, how I'd internalized my father's violence as somehow normal or deserved, how that moment in the kitchen had crystallized everything. I'd smiled because I'd seen the endgame finally, seen that survival was measured in months now instead of years, seen that his power was an illusion maintained only by my compliance. The smile had been my declaration of independence before I even knew I'd be filing legal papers. Judge Sullivan listened intently, occasionally taking notes. When I finished, she asked my father to take the stand. He walked up looking confident, probably thinking he could charm or intimidate his way through this like he'd charmed and intimidated his way through everything else in life. Gregory Finch asked softball questions that allowed my father to present himself as a concerned parent who used firm discipline but never crossed into abuse. Then it was David's turn to cross-examine. Mr. Brennan, do you own a leather belt? David asked casually. My father frowned. Of course I own a belt. Most men do. David pulled out a photo, one of my back covered in welts. Is this what normal discipline looks like to you? My father's face reddened. Kids need consequences for disrespect. That's how I was raised, and I turned out fine. David nodded slowly. Did your father hit you hard enough to break skin? My father hesitated. Sometimes, when I deserved it. David submitted more photos. My black eye, bruised ribs, the welts from various implements. Your son documented years of abuse. These photos show injuries consistent with assault. Can you explain why you felt violence was an appropriate parenting technique? My father's composure started cracking. He was always difficult, always talking back, always questioning my authority. Someone had to teach him respect. David walked closer to the stand. Where does it say in any parenting manual that teaching respect requires giving your child black eyes? My father's lawyer objected, but Judge Sullivan overruled him. My father struggled to answer, his face getting redder, his hands gripping the sides of the witness box. You don't understand what it's like raising a kid like him. Stubborn, willful, always thinking he knows better. Traditional discipline is the only thing that works. David shook his head. Traditional discipline is grounding, removing privileges, assigning extra chores. What you did is called assault. It's illegal when done to a stranger on the street. Why should your son have less protection than a stranger? My father's lawyer called for a sidebar with the judge. After a hushed conversation, Judge Sullivan dismissed my father from the stand. She called my mother next. My mother took the stand looking terrified, wringing her hands in her lap as David questioned her. Mrs. Brennan, were you aware your husband was physically abusing your son? David asked directly. My mother's eyes darted to my father, then back to David. He disciplined him when necessary. I wouldn't call it abuse. David pulled out my journal, reading excerpts where I documented my mother seeing injuries and saying nothing, walking away when my father got violent, actively telling me to stop provoking him. Your son documented numerous occasions where you witnessed violence and did nothing. That's called complicity. You had a legal obligation to protect your child. Why didn't you? My mother started crying, mascara running down her face. I didn't know what to do. He's my husband. I thought if I just kept the peace, made things smoother, it would be okay. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. Her admission hung in the air, condemning in its honesty. She'd chosen her husband over her son, chosen comfort over courage, chosen complicity over protection. Judge Sullivan dismissed her and called for closing arguments. Gregory Finch argued that I was a rebellious teenager seeking to escape reasonable parental authority, that the emancipation would be detrimental to my development, that I needed structure and guidance only parents could provide. David countered with evidence of systematic abuse, documentation of my maturity and financial stability, and the fundamental right of every human to be safe from violence. When both lawyers finished, Judge Sullivan sat back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. I've been a family court judge for 20 years, she said finally. I've seen a lot of troubled families, a lot of kids trying to escape difficult situations. This case is different. The evidence of abuse is overwhelming and well documented. The petitioner has demonstrated unusual maturity and has secured employment and housing. Most significantly, this young man smiled when his father hit him. That detail tells me everything I need to know about his mental state and the level of trauma he's endured. That smile was survival, was defiance, was the moment he chose himself over fear. Judge Sullivan continued, her voice firm. I'm granting the petition for emancipation effective immediately. The temporary restraining order is made permanent. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan are to have no contact with their son except through legal counsel. I'm also referring this case to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges related to child abuse. Mr. Brennan, what you did to your son is not discipline. It's assault. Mrs. Brennan, your failure to protect your child is unconscionable. This court finds that emancipation is in the best interests of the minor. She banged her gavel, and I felt something enormous shift inside me. It was over. I was free. Legally, completely, irreversibly free. My father stood up shouting, saying the judge was biased, that this was a travesty, that he'd appeal. Security guards moved toward him, and he sat down, his face purple with rage. My mother just cried silently. I turned away from both of them and walked out of the courtroom with David, Trevor's parents, and Mrs. Reeves following. Outside the courthouse, David shook my hand firmly. You did it. You're officially emancipated. Your parents have no legal authority over you anymore. I nodded, feeling oddly numb. I'd spent so much energy building toward this moment that now that it was here, I didn't know what to feel. Relief, definitely. Vindication. But also a strange sadness for the family I'd never really had, for the childhood that had been stolen by violence and fear. Trevor's parents offered to let me stay with them until I found my own place, which I gratefully accepted. Over the next month, I used my savings to rent a studio apartment near the grocery store. It was small, and the plumbing made weird noises, but it was mine. I decorated it with thrift store furniture and posters, creating a space that felt safe. I finished my senior year of high school living independently, working my job, maintaining decent grades. Teachers who knew my situation checked on me regularly, offering support and encouragement. 6 months after the emancipation, I got a call from a detective named Angela Ortiz. She was investigating my father based on the judge's referral. I need to ask you some questions about the abuse you documented, she said. The DA is considering pressing charges. I met with Detective Ortiz multiple times over the following weeks, giving detailed statements, providing all my evidence. She told me there were other complaints against my father that had been made over the years. Neighbors who'd called about noise, teachers who'd reported concerns, even relatives who'd seen suspicious injuries on me as a child but hadn't followed up. The pattern of behavior was extensive. 2 months later, my father was arrested and charged with multiple counts of assault and child endangerment. My mother was charged as an accessory. The trial was scheduled for the following year. I didn't attend the trial when it happened. David kept me updated on the proceedings, but I chose not to be there in person. I'd already told my story in the Emancipation hearing. I didn't need to relive it again for a jury. My father was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 3 years in prison. My mother received probation and was required to attend parenting classes, though that felt like a cruel joke since she no longer had children to parent. I was 18 by then, working full-time at the grocery store while taking community college classes online. I'd started dating a girl named Nadia, who worked at the coffee shop next door, someone who made me laugh and didn't ask too many questions about my past until I was ready to share it. Life wasn't perfect. I had nightmares sometimes, flinched at sudden movements, struggled with trusting people, but I was building something new from the ruins of my childhood, creating a life where violence had no place. On my 19th birthday, I got a letter forwarded from David's office. It was from my father, written from prison. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won out. The letter was short, written in his cramped handwriting. It didn't contain an apology exactly, more of an explanation. He wrote about his own father, about beatings he'd received as a child, about how he'd thought he was being a better parent because he never went as far as his father had gone. He'd inherited violence and passed it down, genuinely believing it was normal and necessary. He wrote that prison had given him time to think, that therapy was mandatory, and he was learning about anger management and generational trauma. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know he was trying to understand what he'd done wrong. I read the letter twice, then put it in a box with all the other artifacts of my old life, the journal, the photos, the court documents. I didn't write back. Maybe someday I would, or maybe I wouldn't. The choice was mine now, and that freedom was its own kind of healing. I thought about that smile I'd given him in the kitchen, how it had marked a turning point. That smile had been my survival instinct kicking in, my refusal to be broken, my declaration that I was worth more than his rage could diminish. Years later, I graduated from community college with an associate's degree in social work. I'd decided to dedicate my career to helping kids in situations like mine, to being the person Mrs. Reeves had been for me. On graduation day, she was in the audience along with Trevor and his parents, David and Nadia, who'd become my partner in building a life I'd once thought impossible. My parents weren't there, and their absence felt appropriate rather than painful. Some wounds heal but leave scars, and I'd learned to carry mine without letting them define me. That night, I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled, not the desperate survival smile from the kitchen, but a genuine smile of someone who'd escaped hell and built something beautiful from the ashes. I'd survived my father's violence, navigated the legal system, and emerged on the other side intact. That was worth smiling about. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.